With Notebook now, in fact, I was just doing this today, I have an archive of old letters that were written to Ben Franklin, grainy old image of French handwriting, and I can put those into a notebook and I can say, organize these chronologically and summarize each of the notes in English. And it'll do it in 10 seconds. Seriously. That's a huge part of what knowledge work is in whatever field you're in, where you're kind of moving bits around in your mind and through these documents. I see very promising signs in that way as a kind of duet with this technology in a way that was just unimaginable, 2 years ago.
The author of literally 15 books, many of them best-selling New York Times best-selling books. He's a writer and author, but he is now the editorial director of Google Labs. And Google Labs is an important piece of Google's kind of whole AI ecosystem. And they came up with this thing called Notebook LM, which some of you may have heard about. Oh, I hear a few whistles. He did I think it was a cover story of New York Times Sunday Magazine in the spring of 22. ChatGPT 3.5, generative AI came out in November of 22, and he basically said what?
In the summer of 21, I'd seen an interview with Greg Brockman from OpenAI, in which he kind of demoed some of GPT-3, which was the model before ChatGPT. Brockman said this interesting thing in this interview. OpenAI was shifting to this interesting hybrid structure that was going to be part for-profit and part non-profit, which turned out to be kind of a big deal many years later. But at the time, I was in the audience wearing my journalist hat, and I was like, oh, nobody knows about this interesting. Everybody knows about GPT-3, but nobody knows about this interesting new hybrid structure. And that was Sam Altman in the back there throwing a glass. And so I went to the Times Magazine. I said, hey, I want to write a piece, not really about the AI side, but about the org chart, basically, over at OpenAI. And for some reason, they said, go ahead and do that. And so I got access to GPT-3, which wasn't publicly available at that point, in October of 21. And I was like, I at least have to know how this thing works. And I sat down with it. I remembered so vividly. It was like the first time I saw the web in 93, 94, very similar. Got access to GPT-3 and was like, oh shit, this is so much bigger than I realized. And I'll mention this org structure thing in my piece, but I'm gonna write a 10,000 word piece about how computers are mastering language in a true, almost innate way. And that is gonna change everything about computing, and a whole host of things are gonna become possible. And yes, there are problems, yes, it hallucinates, yes, there are alignment issues, yes, there's safety issues, there's a whole host of things to figure out. But what this is not is hype. That was what was clear to me, is that we have to take this seriously. The one mistake you can't make is just say, oh, that's just stochastic parrots, that's just autocomplete on steroids, it's not real. So I wrote this piece, came out in April of 2022, that basically was making that argument. And it was literally the most controversial piece I've ever written in my life. I'm very proud of that piece, but I did not enjoy a second of it being out in the world, because Twitter was filled with people being like, oh, Steven Johnson fell for the hype. It's so naive. He just doesn't understand this stuff. It's not real. So it was actually kind of a low point in my career in a way. But there were two people at Google Labs, which had been newly kind of respawned inside of Google. Clay Bavor, who's since left, and Josh Woodward, who now runs Labs and Gemini app. And they'd been reading my stuff for years. They knew about my obsession with tools for thought and augmenting human intelligence and all that stuff. And they'd read this article. And apparently Clay turned to Josh and was like, maybe we could get Steven come and give an inspirational speech here at Labs. And Josh was like, maybe we could call up Steven and say, would you like to build your dream writing and research tool that you've been kind of chasing your whole life with a bunch of really smart people here in Labs using our language models? And so they just called me out of the blue and said, hey, long-time reader, first-time caller or whatever, would this be interesting? And because I'm not an idiot, I was like, yes, I would like to do that. And I don't know, here we are. Thanks to the amazing cast of characters who helped out.
Explain what it does.
Yeah. How many people have used Notebook LM in this room? Yeah.
That's cool. My gosh, okay.
That's really cool.
Early adopters.
That's so neat. The core idea is that you would not just be having a chat with a general purpose model, but you would always be grounding, in the language that we tried to develop, the model in whatever documents you provided. And so you weren't just saying hey, you know a little bit about everything, ChatGPT. You would say, hey, I'm working on this particular project. For me, it was I'm an author researching this book. Here's my research material. I want you, the AI, to answer all my questions based on this material. I want you to stick to the facts in this material. And over time, we built tools like Citation so that it gives you an answer and it actually points you directly to the passage that it used in answering the question so that you can trust, you can fact check. And you're always like one step away from the actual human knowledge, the original source of that knowledge. So you can always read the original wherever you are in NotebookLM. It's not just back in the training data in some amorphous way. And over time, we began to think of it as a tool for understanding things, really. We don't have a lot of tools for making sense of things. We have tools for like writing, and we have tools for making slide decks and things like that. But everything in Notebook is designed to help you understand and explore the ideas and material and whatever you've loaded in there, whether you're a student or you're an author or whether you're a knowledge worker. And over time, we started thinking like, hey, maybe we can transform the information that you're trying to understand into different formats. And that's when, about 8 months ago, a team inside of Labs that was working on a separate project, some of whom I think may be here, came up with this idea of like, what if you could turn your sources into a simulated podcast conversation between two AI hosts? And that became this thing, Audio Overviews, which is the most viral thing I've ever been involved with in my life. Like, there was a whole skit on Saturday Night Live making fun of us. Like, that's how crazy it got. Those of you who've heard it, there's an immediate feeling of like, wow, that's an amazing, kind of, it's a bit like hearing Siri for the first time. You're like, that really sounds like a human, except it's two people in conversation. And one funny story is we added this feature a few months after we launched it, where you can kind of call into the show. And they talk for like 15 minutes normally. Their whole program is to pull out the most interesting ideas from your material, whatever that material is, and explain it to you and kind of turn it into an interesting story or an interesting set of anecdotes, and just make anything interesting is kind of one of the slogans we have. And we added this interactive feature, and this is like one of those crazy AI moments. It turned out that when you called in to the show to ask a question, you can kind of interrupt them and say like, hey, I'd like to hear more about Thomas Edison, actually. And they're designed to kind of be like, oh, sure, we'll answer that question for you. But it turned out when you did that in the first version of this, the host sounded a little bit irritated that they'd been interrupted. So the tone was like, yeah, I mean, we were going to get to that later in the show, but I guess we could talk about it now. And so we literally had on our roadmap of bug fixes was what we called friendliness tuning, to just make the host less jerks. It's a weird world we're in.
So you write books. You've designed this tool to write books. And when I was talking to him before, I said, well, how much more productive would it make you? And you said, well, it's about 10 to 100 times more productive in writing a book. Explain to people, what do you meant by that? 100 times more productive.
I've written 15,000 books over the last 3 years since I've been at Google. It's incredible.
But even 10 times more productive.
So what I meant, that's not entirely true.
Okay.
What I was saying is that there are certain parts of the workflow of being a nonfiction author, in my case, where there are things that Notebook does that are genuinely 10 to 100 times faster. And I'll give you one example. I write oftentimes historical nonfiction. And one of the things you do when you're kind of managing historical nonfiction is you're managing a timeline, right? There's a lot of events happening. Last book that I wrote, Infernal Machine, was like multiple threaded narratives going over 60 years. And so just keeping track of when each event happened in the sequence and where everyone was on the timeline is very hard. So I would spend hours and hours and hours, because that was built out of like literally like 500 separate newspaper articles that were part of the research for that book, just trying to like get the timeline right. With Notebook now, in fact, I was just doing this today, I have an archive of old letters that were written to Ben Franklin in French in the 1780s that are just raw scans of the handwriting, that some of which have dates. They have not been OCR'd, so it's just a grainy old image of French handwriting. And I can put those into a notebook and I can say, organize these chronologically and summarize each of the notes and explain what it is in English. And it'll do it in 10 seconds. Seriously. At an incredible level of accuracy with citations, all that kind of stuff. So you're trying to write your biography of Ben Franklin and you're like, I have all this stuff in French that I don't understand and it's all disordered and I want to know what's happening in there. How long would that take you to do? Like, a week, infinity, if you don't speak French, and it's the worst part of the work that you have to do, right? So that's not the intellectual creative part of it, that's just like understanding what is there in the core text part of the work. And so Notebook just dramatically increases the speed with which I can do things like that.
How applicable do you think what you're doing there is to all knowledge workers? And do you think we can start calculating like anyone in knowledge work will be twice as productive or 3 times.
To the extent that your work as a knowledge worker involves synthesizing information that is scattered across multiple documents, 300 open tabs like we all have on our browsers, and trying to find that information and remember that information, that's a huge part of what knowledge work is in whatever field you're in, where you're kind of moving kind of bits around in your mind and through these documents. And so I just think that these tools, if we have the right UI for them, which is what we're really trying to do with Notebook as well, there's underlying AI, but also there's the surface that you use to kind of interact with it, and chat is only a part of that. That just feels like a very general purpose kind of problem to solve. In the early days of Notebook, we would often get kind of like, who is it for? What's the target? Is this for students? Is this for like nonfiction authors? Like pick a lane, you know? And we were always like, we don't really want to pick a lane. It feels like a pretty broad avenue, like that, you know, lots of different lanes are going to be, you know, useful. We think it's a pretty big market.
You've written several books, and I just want to say many great books, but one was
They're all
where
so good.
good ideas come from.
Yeah.
About how do we innovate? What is the impact of AI on innovation, particularly if we're heading into 25 years of crazy big challenges?
One of the things that was important in Good Ideas is connecting across disciplines. The whole history of innovation is about that kind of cross-pollination between fields. I think that's one of the places I spend a lot of time in my interactions with Notebook, trying to figure out how capable is it of making those kinds of connections. And a big thing that I often ask, which I think is just amazing that we can ask a computer this, is like I'll load up a bunch of information and I'll say, what is the most surprising fact in this information? Like, what's the thing that knowing what you know about me will surprise me, will expand my horizons in some way, or make some new conceptual link that I wouldn't have been able to make without the AI kind of introducing me to this idea. And I see very promising signs in that way. So I'm starting to use it more as a creative augmentation tool and not just like organize my timeline for me. So I have a new notebook called The Next Book. And I just fill this with documents where I'm kind of like, hey, maybe I'll write about the gold rush, or maybe I'll write about the anti-nukes movement in the 1960s, or maybe I'll write about this, and it's just filled with this stuff. And I'll just sit down and be like, so if I did write about the anti-nukes movement in the 60s and 70s, what would be the opening scene? And it'll be like, well, it could be this, or it could be this, or it could be this. And these tools are amazing at generating possibilities and kind of spinning out new permutations of it. And it's not like it's writing the opening scene for me yet, but I'm kind of like, oh, that's interesting. Let's dive into that a little more. I work as a kind of duet with this technology in a way that was just unimaginable, you know, 2 years ago. So that's what I think is encouraging.
Is there going to be a point where you're going to basically ask the AI, say, hey, write me a book in the style of Steven Johnson, and forget about talking to Steven? Where do you go with that?
Yeah, I mean, if you can generate a podcast now that's quite convincing, sounds like it might be on NPR or whatever, like with one click in Notebook, is there a future where there's a one-click, write me a Steven Johnson book on this topic, I'm interested, I like his style, you know, just figure it out. And I think, crazily enough, like that is an imaginable future now. If we do get to that future, the fate of nonfiction authors like myself will be the least of our problems. Like, it will mean that we will have invented something really profoundly close to like superintelligence. Not that I'm super intelligent. It would be an amazing kind of leap to be able to build an entire, you know, 300-page book of historical research and all that kind of stuff autonomously in 10 minutes. And so if it has that capability, then all of society will have to be restructured with that capability inside of it. So I don't worry too much about me in that scenario. I worry more about the rest of us.
And that is why we got to get together thinking about what's the economy that's going to support all of us going forward. Anyhow, fantastic. Let's give a good round of applause.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Steven.